Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuhu. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa afdalu salati wa tammu taslim wa akmalu tahiyyat ala Sayyidis Sadat, Sayyidina wa Nabiyina Muhammad, Khairil Bariyat wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa atba'ihi ila yawmiddin. Allahumma faqihna fid din. وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our dars Mukhtasar al-Manar, in which we are continuing our look at this important and critical text that serves as the first step in the study of Usul al-Fiqh, particularly according to the way of Usul al-Fiqh, particularly according to the way of the Hanafi school. We had a very important introductory lesson 1, and we're going to review it on what is Usul al-Fiqh, what is the purpose of Usul al-Fiqh, a brief history of Usul al-Fiqh, why we study it, and how the historic journey of the development of Hanafi Usul came to the text that is the origin of the text that we're covering, which is the Manar of Imam al-Nasafi, and then from Imam al-Nasafi to the author of the Mukhtasar of the Manar. So just to recap, we looked at the definition of Usul al-Fiqh. And my autocorrect is not helpful. Keeps autocorrecting usul to usual. So the definition of usul al-fiqh, right? To understand a composite definition, we need to appreciate its parts. Right? To understand a composite definition, are we online? Why not on? Is it not supposed to be finished? Can you make sure you post the link on the... Just 1 second. What time is it supposed to finish? Bismillah. So, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Just 1 second. I didn't receive a notification for this one. On YouTube, is it on as this? Okay, I can see it. Okay, Bismillah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So, we saw that we saw the definition of Usul al-Fiqh. These are the principles of fiqh. So we saw the definition of usul, right? That a principle or a foundation is something that another matter is built upon. fiqh, we saw there's a general definition of fiqh in the Arabic language, right, which is deep understanding, nuanced understanding, and there is a more specific meaning of fiqh in the deen, in religion, which is deep understanding of religion, which is to know the definition of Abu Hanifa is to know oneself, what is for one and against one. And the Hanafis took that definition and applied it to fiqh as the legal subject related to human actions. So they say fiqh is to know oneself, what counts for one and against one in matters of outward action. And there's other definitions, and we'll be looking at that when we look at the text itself. So usul al-fiqh then are those principles by which specific rulings are derived from the evidentiary sources. And we'll share the definitions to this more rigorously. But that's what usul al-fiqh is. So usul al-fiqh is the principles of ijtihad. Right? This is how a mujtahid derives rules from primary texts. But these are also the sound and rigorous principles of textual understanding. This is how any text, if precise and purposeful, from it, rulings would be understood. So they're also the principles of textual interpretation. That we touched upon very significantly 5 reasons why we study usul al-fiqh, right? To increase in understanding, to understand the rulings of the Sharia and how they're derived, to increase in appreciation of the divine command, its scope and wisdom and application, to be able to convey the rulings in a manner that conveys clarity with respect to their basis and reasoning, so it gives other people clarity, appreciation and certitude, to be able to defend mainstream understanding of the Sharia. Number 4, to train sound legal reasoning. This legal thinking, and also how to understand what the fuqaha are saying, both the indications of the texts of the fuqaha, but also to appreciate how what the fuqaha are saying connects back to the primary texts. And number 5, and this we'll touch upon at the end of the course, that for contemporary rulings on new issues, of course the basis is that new rulings are derived from the rulings derived from the mujtahid imams. But when there's significantly new rulings, there's a method on how those are connected back to usul al-fiqh, and we'll see that. So this is not just, okay, you want to address new issues, just go make ijtihad yourself. That's not admitted even for the senior scholars, broadly speaking. But they are guided in their reasoning and addressing of the issues of usul al-fiqh. We also looked at the stages of the history of usul al-fiqh, usul in the age of the mujtahids, how the principles of usul, this is how we understand the thinking of the mujtahid to be guided. In the Hanafi school, the focus was on the legal training of the faqih, right, of the fuqaha. So these principles came with the derived rulings, underlying the derived rulings, right? And that's how usul al-fiqh was transmitted. It was transmitted with the fiqh and in the fiqh. In the fiqh, insofar as it's the derived rulings. And we touched upon the foundational works that encapsulated in the some or many of these principles. Karhi, Jassas, Dabusi, etc. We talked about those in the 300s, in the 4th Islamic century, and then beginning of the 5th Islamic century. And then late in the 5th Islamic century, in the late 400s, you have the works of two great contemporaries, As-Sarakhsi and Bazdawi. And we saw how from there, but these were large works, they were nuanced works, they had a lot of detail. So Imam al-Nasafi in the Manar synthesized these two works in the 600s. He died in the beginning of the 700s. So that's a little bit about these about Usul al-Fiqh. We will be seeing today that Usul al-Fiqh benefits from a number of related subjects because ultimately Usul al-Fiqh looks at how meanings are understood from texts. Texts are expressed in language. So language is very significant in Usul al-Fiqh. But the scholar of Usul al-Fiqh or the faqih, they look at language and what's understood from language with a particular area of concern. They're not just interested in grammar per se or in sarf per se or even balagha per se, but because their concern is what meanings are indicated insofar as it relates to the understanding of ahkam, of rulings. Usul al-Fiqh also is deeply affected by theology. Usul al-Fiqh is deeply affected by theology insofar as theology or aqeedah is the basis of what makes one a believer, right? Because the ahkam, the hukum, relates to whom? The hukum relates to the one morally responsible, right? They're the servant, the abd. So there's a ruling, right? And there's a matter that the ruling relates to. So for example, when you say as-salatu, salatu dhuhr fardu aynin, is fard. Dhuhr is fard ayn. Okay? You have a ruling that this is fard. You have a matter that the ruling relates to, which is the prayer. But who is addressed by the ruling is the one morally responsible, right? That's the one addressed by the ruling. But why does this all matter? Because who is the hakim? Who is the one who established this ruling? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And understanding, so theology affects usul al-fiqh. And that's something that in larger works as we go through, this is a strand. Right? And so there's a theological, metaphysical, spiritual connection of our beliefs, the theology, the principles that support that. One, to know who is God. But then also, there's issues, as we will see when we come, that what is the role of the intellect with respect to understanding commands, with respect to understanding moral responsibility? What's the nature of good and evil? Right? So there are principles that affect, and we'll be seeing that somewhat. Right? So usul al-fiqh cannot be studied divorced from a deep understanding of the Arabic language. Cannot be studied properly without a deep understanding of the ruling. Especially in the Hanafi school, you need to know the rulings of Islamic law. You need to also know and appreciate some elements of theology, and those that are needed, we'll unpack them as we go through the text, right? So that's just a quick recap of what we have covered so far. I wanted to share a thematic overview of Mukhtasar al-Manar before we study the text itself, right? To look at a thematic overview of Mukhtasar al-Manar. The subject matter of Usul al-Fiqh, as you'll see from the opening of the text, is that there's four foundational sources of Sharia, right? There's four foundational sources, four foundational bases for fiqh, and we'll see in which way are these the usul, i.e. these are the sources from which rulings are derived when the principles of usul are applied to them, right? So there's four foundational bases of usul, and this text is structured around these four foundational bases, right? Is structured around these four foundational bases, such that, so the four foundational bases being the Quran, the Sunnah, Iijima, consensus, and qiyas, legal analogy. So the text begins with the Quran, right? The text begins with the Quran, but he'll tell us that the Quran is a text that indicates meanings. So now the Quran can be studied in various ways, right? The scholar of the Arabic language approaches the Quran and appreciates its rhetorical beauty, and they tell us about the inimitability of the Quran from the perspective of balagha and the sciences of balagha related to words, usages, etc. The scholar of tafsir deduces religious meanings in a broad way, a wide range of meanings transmitted and deduced, right? So the scholar of tafsir has another consideration. The scholar of ulum al-Quran, the sciences of the Quran, looks at what you need to understand about the Quran in order to be able to approach the Quran, approach tafsir, and have certitude regarding the Quran as being the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the scholar of Usul al-Fiqh, insofar as their concern is Usul al-Fiqh, is not primarily concerned with any of this. Why? Their concern is very specific, that the Quran is a revealed text, okay, but it is هو اسم للنظم الدال على المعنى, right? It's a name for this text that necessarily indicates meanings. So they don't include many aspects of the definition of the Quran that are key to appreciating all the aspects. So they just look. So for example, the scholars of Usul al-Fiqh don't include in the definition of the Quran that it's inimitable. Why? Because insofar as deducing meanings from the Quran, is it significant that's inimitable or not? Not exactly. If the Quran, if we can establish that this is from Allah, it's not inimitable. Someone else could have written it too, but we can establish this is from God. Now, if we know this is from God, God's saying do these things. You're still bound by it, right? So, insofar as they're concerned with respect to the Quran, this is the revealed text indicating meanings. But these other aspects of it are important, which is why at level 2, we also study ulum al-Quran, the sciences of the Quran. Any student of knowledge needs to be cultivating and deepening their knowledge of grammar and taking it seriously. And then you get to things like balagha, etc., because these all come in. In the Manar, past this, you see also the indications of dilalat mabhath al-huruf, what the particles indicate in the Arabic language. Why? Because that's very critical to textual understanding. So you would expect that when the author is talking about Quran, he would go into the history of the Quran and this and this. And no, they go straight into how meanings are understood from the text, right? Because the Quran, so what are the meanings of words? How they are affirmed, understood, used, and deduced, right? And we'll go into the details of that when we come to it, right? So that's the first part of the text. It looks at the Quran, but from this perspective. Here you would do well to do some related readings on the inimitability of the Quran, etc. Some of the things that we touched upon in level 1 when we did the essentials of the Islamic tradition. How, what's it called? How Islam works, right? How Islam works, the essentials of the Islamic tradition. We touched upon some of those aspects of how we know the Quran is true from Allah, etc. And that would be a good review. And those who haven't done it, that's a very useful, accompanying course. And we can put here as a recommended resource for this course, right? Then, conceptually, he looks at the Sunnah. The author looks at the Sunnah. And because the second source from which rulings are understood. But there are slightly differing considerations with respect to the Sunnah, because the Quran is all mass transmitted. It's all mutawatir. So it's all decisive in its transmission. The principles of textual interpretation apply to the Sunnah, but there's considerations of the ways the Sunnah is transmitted, between that which is mass transmitted, that which is mutawatir, that which is widely transmitted, mashhur, and that which is singularly transmitted, ahad. And there are a number of related investigations that come up, that are meanings understood from the actions of the Prophet ﷺ or from his words, right? Af'alun Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And how are they understood? A number of related investigations. Another of the issues that arises that's very important, particularly in the Hanafi school, is what is the legislative place of the opinions of the companions. And this is a source of significant differences between our school and the other, and we'll be looking at that. So under the Sunnah, a number of related considerations come up. Then you have consensus, Iijima, right? Now, to understand Iijima, and here particularly the text gets very brief. In parts 3 and 4, right? Especially under consensus and ijtihad, consensus, ijma, the text gets very brief. But to understand consensus, you also understand whose consensus counts. So we see related investigations of what is ijtihad, what are the shurut of the mujtahid, the conditions of the mujtahid, right? And a whole number of related issues arise. Then the opposite of the mujtahid is the muqallid. So there are investigations that arise there as well. Of course, the Hanafis are sort of very purpose driven, so they jump straight, a lot of the text jump straight into the first investigations. They don't give you, in many of the texts, a roadmap. Why? Because you're smart. Very smart. Like before you jump into something, know why you're covering it and what's going to be covered. That's on you, right? And then the fourth aspect, analogy, qiyas, which is of course analogy is something, analogy directly from the primary sources is done by the mujtahid. But how analogy works, and especially the issue, because analogy is made through the issue of determining the illah, the effective legal cause, right? The effective legal cause that the ruling is objectively built upon, such that if the legal cause is found, the ruling is found. If not found, the ruling is not found. And there are very rigorous conditions for the qiyas. This is not covered. This is covered in a very cursory way over here. It's certainly not enough. Some of these areas will be expanding on a need basis. There's an area that is essentially missing, which is istihsan, which is legal preference. It's an important characteristic of the Hanafi school, legal preference, and we'll be looking at it when we come to istihsan, legal preference, which is leaving the obvious line of legal reasoning for a secondary line of legal reasoning. And there's wisdom why it's not mentioned over here. And so then if we go through the structure of the text, right, just to give a broad, do you have the text on you? You don't have the text? Okay. Bismillah. So, in the first section, he looks at, so there's the first section of the text, which is looking at the Quran. After giving us the definition of the Quran, he looks at how meanings are understood from words, right? And there are, so the first is that words themselves are of 4 types, right? And these are called wujuhun nazm. There's 4 types of words, right? So there's the 4 types of words, and right? Because a word can be specific or general. It can indicate a specific meaning or a general meaning. It can have a shared meaning, right? Where the word, like al-ain, it can refer to an eye or a spring or to the sun or the essence of something, right? That's mushtarak. It indicates more than one meaning without one being predominant. And then there's al-mu'awwal, where something can indicate more than one meaning, but we understand a particular meaning to relate. Under this, so this is the different types of words, wujuhun nazm. There's a whole number of issues that arise. Amongst them is, very usefully, and the Hanafi ulama put it right in the beginning, they mentioned the issue of the divine command. Because the divine command, and it's befitting to put it right early in the text, because ultimately that's what fiqh is about. There's the divine command. The divine command is the command. The amr is, in the Arabic language, the command uses a specific expression, right? And so the command, the amr, falls under the khas. It's a khas type of word. It's a specific type of word. So we look at the whole series of investigations related to the command fall under how words are, how meanings are understood from the words themselves. And there's 4 types. We'll be unpacking that next class, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And from that, how you fulfill the divine command comes up, right? Because you can fulfill it either within its time or outside its time. There's some theological issues arise that the command of Allah subhanahu, that what is the role of the intellect in discerning the divine command? What is the nature of good and bad? How is good and bad established? Can the intellect discern the good and bad? What is the moral responsibility of the intellect's capacity to discern good and bad? So we look at, related issues, right? And then you have the general and the specific. The general, the shared, the mushtarak, and the mu'awwal, a word of more than one meaning, but one meaning is understood, is mu'awwal. We'll come to it. Then the second part, this all related to how meanings are understood from the texts. This is in the context of the Quran. So there are the words themselves, insofar as they indicate meanings. Then there's the words in terms of how they how clearly meanings are affirmed from them, right? And there's degrees of indication of meaning, right? There's degrees of indication of meaning of the word itself. You have the zahir, they have an apparent meaning, right? You have a nas, which indicates one meaning and it could not possibly indicate another. And there's other, and then there's the opposite, how clearly meanings are affirmed or how unclear the meanings are, right? So this is also, because ultimately we want to understand the command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To understand the words are of different types. Something can indicate a specific meaning or a general meaning or a shared meaning or a mu'awwal meaning. We understand how, what meaning is understood. How clearly or how unclearly a meaning is affirmed. Thirdly, how the words are used. This is called wujuh isti'mal al-nazm. Right? Because an expression could be used literally, haqiqah, and that's the basis, or there could be figurative usage. But there are criteria for there being figurative usage, otherwise you have hadmu shara'i', you demolish divine guidance. If anything could be figuratively interpreted, you just figuratively interpreted everything and nothing remains. And that's one of the concerns of the literalists. And we share a little of the concern, but we don't accept their whole argument, of course. And then there's other aspects to how words are used. Then, and I'm off in my numbering, I apologize. I struggle after the number 3. Then how meanings are understood from the text, right? So this is called wujuh al-wuquf ala ahkam al-nazm. You can understand the meaning from the expression of the text, what the text itself says. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, don't say uff to them regarding one's parents. So explicitly, this is called ibaratun nas, we don't say uff to them. But there's also a dilala of the nas, which is don't speak disrespectfully to them, right? This is dilalatun nas. You have isharatun nas, the indication of the text, which is the importance of respecting parents, or birrul walidain is understood from it. That's not what the text is saying, but there's an ishara to it, clearly. And there's something necessarily implicit in a text, iqtida'un nas, and we'll see that. So So these are how meanings are understood from the texts. Right? So this is the Quran section, and there are a number of underlying issues that arise from that. Those are the sections related to Quran. Then in part 5, we look at the Sunnah. Right? In part 5, we look at the Sunnah. And the Hanafis have a distinct method from the Muhaddithin regarding it. And so we'll take a little bit of time to look at this aspect, right? That partly arising from certain key concepts in the Hanafi school, something we'll be discussing throughout. The Hanafi, Imam Abu Hanifa, distinguished between the qat'i and the dhanni, between the decisive and the non-decisive. So, and from that, he distinguished between the mass transmitted, the mutawatir, and the generally transmitted, or the widely transmitted, the mashhur, and the singular transmissions in terms of levels of indication. But then there's also other issues that come up. What is the role of the mursal hadith? Right? A hadith in which there is a skip in the chain. Right? And there are discussions related to that, and those are important to appreciate, that just because a hadith scholar says an evidence is weak does not necessarily mean that the evidence is weak, because it's weak according to the standards of the muhaddith, but the muhaddithin themselves have different criteria, right? And the Imam Abu Hanifa, as a mujtahid, had interpretive principles related to how he dealt with the evidences, the transmitted evidences of the Sunnah. In the Sunnah, a number of related issues arise as well. Right? Amongst them, very significantly, something that we address in the next section, which is conflicting texts. It's called ta'arud al-adilla. Right? Ta'arud al-adilla, or ta'arud bayn al-hujaj. Right? That if there's apparent conflict between the texts, and sometimes this is considered separately from the Sunnah, sometimes considered with the Sunnah. There's guiding text. And of course, but conflicting text is those texts in which there is an apparent conflict. It doesn't mean there's an actual conflict. There's no conflict between the texts if soundly understood. Right? But how are they soundly understood? That is part of divine wisdom that He has granted us, the scholars, and granted us as those who follow the scholars. This is part of the moral responsibility, to follow what is sound. And related to conflicting texts, there are other discussions related to the Sunnah, most notably, what is the status of the actions of the Prophet ﷺ? Because rulings are primarily understood from commands. What is the role of actions? Right? Because actions also have indication. And if there's a command and an action, how does one piece it together? Related to the Sunnah is that which is transmitted to us of shar'u man qablana, the sacred law of those before us. Right? And the ruling is related to the opinions of the Sahaba. Right? The opinions, positions, and actions of the Sahaba. Right? So these are some of the... And then we go on to consensus, Iijima. And here the text starts getting more brief. Iijima is dealt with very briefly, although it's a very important area and it has a very critical role in hifz ad-din. Right? Because there's a very limited scope concept of ijtihad, but there's also a broad notion of ijma', a very specific role of ijma', which is, but much of the deen is agreed upon, right, in a broad scope, right? And we'll see both the specific usage of ijma and the broad usage, because it has important implications. Then there is qiyas, legal analogy. This too is covered very briefly, and there is legal analogy, right? Al-qiyas. This is covered very, very briefly. We'll unpack it just a little bit, but not a lot, because there's a wisdom why the author covers it very briefly, but we'll talk about some of the related concepts that one needs to be clear about in our times. And related to legal analogy, qiyas, is istihsan, legal preference, which actually doesn't come up in this work. Again, for great wisdom, which is that he deliberately, in Mukhtasar al-Manar, he really narrows the scope of the text for wisdom. So does Imam al-Nasafi in the Manar. There are investigations that are there both in Sarakhsi and in Usul al-Bazdawi, but Imam al-Nasafi does not unpack them fully aware of them. I mean, he is a master of Usul. Imam al-Nawawi, Imam al-Nasafi, he's written a number of great works in Usul, but that's part of understanding which stage of learning this relates to. So we'll keep that in mind, but point out those things that are of relevance to where we are in our journey through the subject. Who makes legal analogy? The mujtahid. So we look at the issue of ijtihad. And again, ijtihad is covered exceedingly briefly, right? But ijtihad brings us to the issue of taqleed, and we'll look at what is ijtihad, who is the mujtahid, how fiqh is derived in our times, what is the role, what are some of the guiding principles related to informed taqleed, right? Informed legal following. So that's ijtihad. Then to appreciate qiyas and ijtihad, etc., there are a number of legal terms that need to be understood. So he touches upon these legal terms. Amongst them, what is a sabab, a cause? What are asbab? What are ilal? What are the objective legal causes, or the effective legal causes, and the shurut, what are conditions? Another important investigation towards the end of the book, again covered somewhat briefly, is the issue of legal capacity, because the one the rulings relate to is the morally responsible person. What gives someone full legal capacity? And then there is, in the larger works, it's unpacked more fully. They are awaridut taklif. There are things that affect legal capacity, affect ahliya, right? Some things diminish legal capacity, right? Such as, there's some things that remove legal capacity, such as insanity, loss of consciousness, etc. But there's other things that diminish it, like ata, someone who has impairment in their, partial impairment in their mental faculties. And then there are states that affect your effective capacity, sickness, travel, disability, etc. So this, and then there's a number of legal related issues that arise. They're listed here as the mutafarriqat. Briefly, there's a number of related issues that it touches upon in passing. That's an overview of the text, right? Just to get a sense of how we'll navigate. So broadly, it covers, as a framework, there are four sections of the text. Things that relate to the Quran, primary concern is how words express meaning, how apparent the meanings are, how are they used, how rulings are derived from them. So there's investigations related to that. Those apply, of course, also to the Sunnah, but part 2 is the Sunnah. And there we have the issue of how the Sunnah is transmitted, the actions of the Prophet ﷺ, the actions of the Sahaba, shar'u man qablana, etc., as outlined. And then you have Ijma' and Qiyas, and the related issues related to legal analogy, capacity, etc. That's the structure of the text. So it's very logically structured. It's not explicitly laid out necessarily in that way. And then, how do we understand and master this text? How do we understand and go towards mastering this text? And focus on mastering this text. Don't, some of the mashayikh would ban the student from reading any commentaries, etc. You're welcome, if you would like, to follow along in the, and we'll be referring to it in the Allahumma salli ala sayyidina, the commentary of Allama Qasim ibn Qutlubugha, but focus on understanding the text, right? What's the purpose of this text, right? We can summarize the purpose of the text and our study of it is, number 1, to gain understanding of the key areas of Usul al-Fiqh, Quran, Sunnah, particularly, and also Ijma', Qiyas. Right? Ijma' and Qiyas, in a very brief way, a lot of the focus of the text is on the aspect of how meanings are understood from texts, right? To understanding the key areas of Usul al-Fiqh. Number 2, to appreciate through the study, and we'll be looking at some of these key underlying characteristics of Hanafi Usul, some of which in previous study of this Hanafi fiqh you would have appreciated the distinction between what is qat'i and what is dhanni, what is decisive and what is non-decisive, and how the qat'i and the dhanni interplay with one another. For example, number 3, to understanding key characteristics of Hanafi Usul, to understand key underlying principles, right, and their applications. Right? So we'll look at keystone examples, right? Some of the more complex examples that come in the Manar itself and later, we'll transition towards them, but try to understand them. Then, as we go through the text, to understand the key concepts of Usul al-Fiqh. What is the khas? What is the am? Right? And to be able to place them in this map. Okay, the khas and am, what do they relate to? They relate to textual understanding. What part of textual understanding? The type of word it is. What is the difference between the zahir and the nas? Okay, that relates to this type of textual understanding, right, of how apparent the meaning is. Okay, what is the ibaratun nas versus the isharatun nas, the expression of the text, and what is the allusion of the text? Okay, that is from how meanings are derived from the texts through their levels of indication, or through the types of ways rulings are understood from text. Okay, so you have a mental map of that, right? Ideally, you should be able to define all these core terms, and you should be able to distinguish one term from another. What's the difference between the muhkam and the nas? Say, well, they're both. That's fuzzy understanding, right? Of course, don't worry if you don't understand the terms just used, because that's why we're studying the text, right? So these are 4 purposes of our study of the text. Understand the key areas of Usul al-Fiqh, the key characteristics of Hanafi Usul, some of the key underlying principles and their applications, such as the decisive and the non-decisive, and then the core concepts of Usul al-Fiqh itself, to know their definitions and to be able to distinguish one term from another. If you come out with that, you're doing quite well. Now, how do we try to master this text? Right? First, of course, you turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, have a clear sense of purpose why you're studying it, ask Allah for assistance, etc. So their first duty, write out the text, right? If you're not committed to do that, there's better things to do this summer, right? Like, honestly, if you're studying a technical text and you're not writing it out, you're welcome to attend. We're not going to kick anybody out, but you're missing out, right? So write out the text. Try to write it out logically. If by now you don't have a system by which you take notes, then find a system by which you take notes. Well, I do it this way. Well, be informed by a solid system of note-taking. And there's a number of systems out there. And write out the text in a logical manner. Number 2, diagram each section yourself. There's a number of texts that give you diagrams, but then the whole idea of the diagrams is that you can conceive of the whole subject yourself, right? So someone else's diagrams may help you inform your diagramming, but if you just copy their diagrams, you didn't diagram the text, you copied someone else's diagrams, which defeats the purpose to a large extent, right? So try to try to take care of that. Number 3, write out the definitions, right? Write out the definitions, and in some places we'll be sharing more rigorous definitions, etc., for particular purposes, and it wouldn't be of harm to, and some places I'll be pointing out that such and such a definition is superior, or etc. So pay attention to that, right? But a lot of students just, it's easy, Google, a little bit of Googling, and you'll find some good breakdown of Hanafi definitions, and you're like, okay, found it, right? But then the whole point of diagramming it is that you can see what fits where, right? And it's possible to diagram the whole of Usul al-Fiqh in one diagram, right? And that's one of the challenges for a diligent student. Can you logically and clearly diagram all of Usul al-Fiqh in one diagram? Omar, could you just put this up? No, is it appearing? So there's a work that diagrams all of Usul al-Fiqh. Can you guys see it? Is it on the screen? It's on the screen, but it's captured. Okay. So, of course, you don't need to capture that, but all the investigations of Usul al-Fiqh are mentioned and diagrammed in one circular diagram. Right? But you could just copy something like that out, but you're trying to capture it. This is really cool. And actually the author, if you look at it, writes very clearly. Right? He learned Ruk'ah, right? And it's beautifully written out. Right? But there's right? He diagrams the Sunnah as well in some detail, etc. And just to be a teaser, this is the Muhammad Amin Suwaid wrote it. It's actually died about 90 years ago, just under 90 years ago, 1355. And it's not necessarily a recommended text. It has its ups. It's a beneficial text, but don't get. But you can diagram it many ways. You can do a tree diagram or a mind map of the whole text. You can do it section by section, and you can connect them together. I would recommend do it section by section and then piece things together. But this is extremely beneficial, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So if we go back, right, these are 3 steps, right? Right? 3 steps to, and then you have to review, right? You have to review. We will be sharing some recommended readings, some definitions, etc. Do those, right? And then stay focused, because if you branch out too much, you'll just get confused and frustrated, right? You also have to appreciate the Mukhtasar al-Manar is a stepping stone to the study of Usul, right? The author, who died in the early 800s, I believe 808 Hijri, right? He deliberately, and he was a great scholar, he really simplified the text. And sometimes, some modern authors, editors say, well, he missed this and he didn't mention this. There's a clear there's a clear educational purpose that, okay, let's limit the scope of the issues. Why? Because this is for students of knowledge to build their understanding to get to the next stage. Generally, after a text like Mukhtasar al-Manar, one would do the Manar itself with a brief commentary. Then ideally, one would do another work. In the Islamic studies curriculum, inshallah, that text is the Muntakhab of al-Husami, of Husam al-Din al-Ikhsikhthi. And we've mentioned him previously. So after Mukhtasar al-Manar, one would do the Manar itself with a brief commentary, brief simple commentary. Then the Muntakhab of al-Husami, Husam al-Din al-Ikhsikhthi. Then after that, one would do a larger commentary on the Manar, such as Ifadatul Anwar of Imam al-Haskafi, the author of Ad-Durr al-Mukhtar. And then after Ifadatul Anwar, one would go either directly to the Tawdih of Sadr al-Sharia, or if one is able to take a step before the Tawdih, to do the Mir'ah of Mullah Khusro, then the Tawdih. And that is enough for someone who wants a rounded out understanding of Usul al-Fiqh, right? And the way of mastery, there are many texts one could do potentially beyond that. But it'll come in due time, right? Right now, we don't want to distract by having all these texts, but this is sort of a broad roadmap. Mukhtasar al-Manar, then the Manar with a brief commentary, then the Muntakhab of al-Husami with maybe a brief explanatory commentary, then Ifadat al-Anwar, Sharh al-Manar of al-Haskafi, upon which there's the Hashiyah of Ibn Abidin, Nasamat al-Ashar. Then after that you have either directly the Tawdih of Sadr al-Sharia, his commentary on his Tanqih, or with one step before that, which is the Mir'ah of Mullah Khusro, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayhi. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for facilitation, ease and assistance. We will be relying upon the commentary of Allama Qasib ibn Qutlubugha, and we'll be sharing a PDF of that as well. So if you are, if you do register for this class, we'll give you access to the course page where the previous recordings will be made available there as well as the these course slides and recommended resources. Nasal Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at-taysir wa at-tawfiq. Next class, we're going to look at the opening of the book, where he tells us the usul of the Sharia are 4, or technically 3 plus 1. And then we'll look at the Mabahithul Kitab, begin looking at the investigations related to the Quran. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما والحمد لله رب العالمين. Any questions before we close?
If someone wasn't planning on becoming a scholar, but they want to do intermediate studies in fiqh, would they be able to survive without usul fiqh, or is usul fiqh like extremely important?
What, you've got other life plans now?
No.
Okay. I mean, people can fake it with all kinds of stuff, right? But even like an educated Muslim should have studied usul al-fiqh, right? Like someone's religiously illiterate, religiously uncultured without usul al-fiqh, because they don't know what's going on, right? There's a difference between, you don't have to be like only a doctor treats someone who has COVID-19 or whatever, right? But someone who's informed is not like one who's uninformed, right? Right? Someone, an educated person has a certain amount of literacy in life, right? And particularly in all civilized societies, right? Like someone asked Gandhi what he thought about European civilization. He said he thought it would be a good idea, or something to that effect, right? But there's a certain amount of just literacy that a person should have. So usul al-fiqh at a general level is from general literacy, like what's in the how Islam works, maybe a little more, something like this. There's a certain amount of literacy that someone needs. Otherwise, they won't have the basis of appreciating what's going on in the Quran, what is going on even in ahadith, etc. You see these meanings all around you, right? So it's a stunted understanding. And many students of knowledge have very stunted understandings because they don't have the foundational principles. They don't know usul al-fiqh. They don't know, and these foundational concepts are part of a religious literacy, right? So anyone who's a religiously literate Muslim should have done this basic literacy, which is sort of step 1 of level 1 of the Islamic studies curriculum. But any concerned Muslim should have should strive to complete level 1 and 2 in their life. That just gives you a solid foundational understanding. It gives you clarity, it gives you understanding, it helps with certitude, deeper appreciation of the guidance of Allah and His Messenger, and how to to be lived and understood, navigational principles with respect to how one interfaces with Islamic scholarship, etc. Yeah, people, a talib ilm could survive in life, their whole life, without ever knowing any balagha. But how capable are they themselves to appreciate the beauty of the Quran? It's limited. Of course, inanimate objects are moved by the Quran. Right? But there's a difference between هل يستوي الذين يعلمون والذين لا يعلمون. Right? Are those who know like those who don't? Any other questions, inshallah? Wa alaikum salam.
What are the distinguishing qualities of Qutb's commentary on Mukhtasar al-Manar? How is it differentiated from that of Mudal al-Qawi and Azali, Sayvasi, I think? And secondly, what are some recommended secondary readings, or should we just restrict ourselves to the commentary of Qutb?
So, Imam Allama Qasim ibn Qutb, will talk a little bit about him, just a touch next week. The focus of his commentary is to clarify the text. Right? That's why his commentary has been the most taught. Also because of how significant he is as a scholar, but he's significant as a scholar because of the strength of his scholarship. That's a clear comment. It's more than enough, right? We'll be pointing to a few resources, etc. If there's one secondary resource that we would point you to, it would be, and we should include this in the course page, it's a contemporary work, but it's a good contemporary work. The ulama praise it. It's called Al-Mujaz of Al-As'adi. And we'll be pointing to some parts of that. It's not a required reading. There's an old edition online and a more recent edition online. Al-Mujaz of Mawlana Muhammad Ubaidullah al-As'adi. And it has forewords by Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda and Sayyid Abul Hassan Ali Nadwi. And the Mashayikh praise the work. Right? Right? And it's a good work. But don't get lost in its details. It's not recommended reading. It's a recommended reference. I'll be pointing to some of its definitions, a few things here and there. Don't get lost in the details. The most important thing are those. Our goal here is to have a clear framework and to be able to distinguish between the different terms. Right? But this is a useful text, right? And so the other text that we can recommend, again, I'll be pointing to it here and there, is Al-Muyassar, so Al-Mujaz of Al-As'adi, and you have Al-Muyassar of Sheikh Ibrahim As-Silqini. And when I got to Damascus, I was very anti-contemporary text. I still largely am. But Sheikh Hassan Al-Hindi told me to read Al-Muyassar. I didn't like that. I said, see, what about an old book, etc.? It says, read Al-Muyassar. I was like, okay. What else can I read? He said, read Al-Muyassar. He said, read the whole thing. Same day or the next day, I went to visit Sheikh Muhammad Qaylish and he started talking about Sheikh Ibrahim al-Silqini and what a great scholar he is. And the Sheikh Hassan and Sheikh Muhammad Qaylish did not interact closely with one another or anything. But he's it's a contemporary book. It's written in easy structure, etc. Again, too much detail for what we're doing right now, but we'll be pointing to it here and there selectively. And he's one of the great scholars from Halab, from a great scholarly tradition. And there's some beautiful things there. We'll be touching upon it very selectively, but it's a beneficial work. Of course, there's Usul al-Fiqh, there's great classical writings, contemporary writings, etc. But as they say, khutwa, khutwa, step by step. Any other questions?
I have one more question.
Go ahead.
So we study Usul al-Fiqh as a separate subject, or it's in a separate class from the Kins. How do we join the two together, given that they're interrelated subjects?
Don't. Right? Understand the Kins as taught and as indicated. Understand Usul al-Fiqh as taught, indicated. You will see interrelationships, but you don't mix things there's a right time to bring things together, but don't, when we go through, you'll see some examples that are pointed to, etc., but that's way beyond the scope of what we're doing right now. That comes, and there are great works on, of what's called Takhrijul Furu' al-Usul ala al-Furu' or Takhrij al-Furu' ala al-Usul, of mentioning the Furu', the legal rulings that are derived from the Usul. Imam al-Tumurtashi has a great work on that, al-Usul ila Qawa'id al-Usul, and others. But step by step. Those are thinking questions. Okay, so we'll stop there and we'll start the next class, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, at 5:30.